So we're here with our latest episode of Your Questions Answered. I'm Todd with Pastor Steve here, and the goal of this podcast each week is to kind of reflect back on the sermon that was preached and ask some questions. So we collect some questions from those in the congregation, those who are watching online. If you have a question, feel free to message us and or grab me. This happened this past Sunday.
Grab me gently, though, right?
Grab me gently, yeah. She used that verb carefully, yeah. So our first question, we have a couple questions brewing up. We'll talk about, you mentioned it's a great sermon, by the way. I love how you tied in Psalm 22 with what Jesus quoted David, and what a powerful message right before Easter, first of all. So thank you for that. But you touched on persecution. David was persecuted by Saul. So we could start with that question. David was persecuted. He had quite literally had spears thrown at him by Saul in demonic rage. And at least the scripture you brought out Sunday, he fled, but he came back to Saul again. What's happening there? When do you know, when should you leave from a situation? I can't think of much worse than somebody trying to kill you. What would you say to that?
Yeah, no, it's such a good and important question because it has huge implications, right, for everything from, let's say a woman who's in a domestic violence situation and her husband's beating her at home. Does she go back? Well, David, and some have used that actually. David went back. Saul was throwing spears at him. Wow. So it has nothing to do with that. Okay. I'm going to put that right out there right now that no, if you're in an unsafe situation like that, you get out of the house. That's not being persecuted for righteousness' sake, and that's what I think where the difference is. And that's how Jesus said it, right? In the Beatitudes, it wasn't blessed you who are persecuted for the gospel's sake. He said, blessed you who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, when you're persecuted for righteousness' sake. So simply standing for righteousness, simply living an upright life will invite the forces of darkness to come against you. Like that. So, David went back. The apostles stayed in Jerusalem when they were being persecuted by Saul. The church scattered, but the 12 stayed in Jerusalem. It's almost a kind of overlooked aspect of the persecution of the church that the 12 that Jesus called stayed in the place where they were at risk. They could have been taken at any moment. I don't know how Saul didn't catch up with them. They must have been really clever in keeping their meeting places and keeping themselves hid from him, but they did. And throughout history, believers have said we're not leaving the country where God has established us just because we're now the target of all kinds of things. Almost all of the martyrs who have existed throughout history were ones who felt called to stay. And that's where I think the distinction should be made, that I think what I was getting at was that the circumstances alone aren't the word of the Lord.
Okay.
So just because it's getting hot, just because persecution's coming our way, that's not automatically the Lord saying it's time for you to go. A friend of mine said it so well, when you feel like the grace is running out, you've got to determine whether the Lord has withdrawn the grace or whether you need to draw upon the grace. And there's a big difference in how we respond based on that. Dietrich Bonhoeffer comes to mind. He was in the United States, had a great teaching gig at, I forget if it was Union or General Seminary in Manhattan, and they loved him over here. He could have had a lifelong tenure, found a great church. He was really thriving here in the U.S., but when he heard what was going on back in his home country in Germany, and of course he'd already spoken out against it, and he knew what was happening, he felt like God was calling him to go back. Wow. And really put himself right in the middle of harm's way, knowing I may die. I might not ever be seen again. And his friends in the U.S. tried to talk him out of it, but he said, that's where I'm called. So he actually ran to the thing. That's the ultimate kind of courage, to be able to do that. And that's what David exhibited. Of course, spoiler alert, he will leave eventually. So more on that when we get up to that. Okay. I'll share it in the message. How to know when to leave is a really important thing to discern spiritually. But the main thing is it has to be discerned spiritually. And we in the West, and especially in America, have become so accustomed to comfort, so accustomed to no persecution, so accustomed to being on the high road, on the high places anyway, culturally speaking, that I think we've got a little comfortable that even a little bit of persecution and we're ready to book it out of there and say, well, this isn't the place for me. Where God might be just saying, no, I put you in a dark place on purpose. I believe you're strong enough. Together, we'll bring light into this place, and we'll bring the kingdom into some very dark places together.
Well, you mentioned the culture of America a little bit. Maybe this leads to another question. That the culture of America, especially Christian culture, is experiencing more persecution in some areas. And you mentioned that David's response was not to flee, and to the classic fight or flight response. So if you don't have a flight or flee from a situation, is the alternative to fight? And if so, what does a Christian fighting look like, especially in the context of Jesus and his commands to love?
Yeah. I mean, we're coming up on Good Friday here, where as a sheep before his shearers was silent, so was Jesus. Of course, he wasn't completely silent, through his trial. He did have some things to say, but they weren't mean-spirited. You revile me, I'm going to revile you back.
Yeah.
Even you look at Jesus' interview before the Sanhedrin, the chief priests and the high priest, his responses to them were, number one, to declare who he was, but also, I think he was still trying to reach them. When you look at the things that he challenged them on, the things that he said, if there was any fair-minded person left in the room, they could have been moved by what Jesus said, that he's not cursing us back, he's not doing what normal criminals do and blasphemers do. And maybe he did, I don't know. Scripture doesn't record, history doesn't record anybody that got saved in Caiaphas' courtroom there, but he did answer back, and he did answer the Pharisees all week long. If this is a great week to read through Jesus Week in Jerusalem. Start with the triumphal entry and read all the way through the crucifixion. In Matthew's gospel especially, goes into great lengths to describe what happened during that week. And he was asking and answering questions, and he went right after the Pharisees. There did come a point in time where Jesus, Matthew 23, woe to you Pharisees, and he went off on them. And he wasn't, at some point, he wasn't afraid to speak the truth to them and even he was pronouncing a curse over them in that moment. Woe to you is a terminology of curse. Now, that is the Son of God with all confidence behind him. What usually we end up doing is we get offended. Sometimes we get offended personally, most of the time offended on behalf of the Lord and on behalf of the gospel. And we've got to really grow up to discern what's a righteous indignation and what's just us getting offended.
Okay.
To speak out of an offended spirit is to partner with the kingdom of darkness. Always. Even if we're speaking truth, we're partnering with the kingdom of darkness in that moment. And we've just got to be really wise. This is what Jesus meant when he said, you got to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. How is a serpent wise? Well, he knows when to strike and he knows when to hide or to pull away. Harmless as doves means I'm not going to personally attack you. I'm not going to seek your destruction. I'm not hoping that evil things happen to you. But what Jesus did was spoke as a prophet to the nation of Israel and to the leadership of Israel and called out all of their hypocrisy right before everybody. Just so, let's just put it all out there. And I believe that there is going to be a need for that in this hour in the appropriate spirit and in the appropriate place, not to be afraid to speak, as we say in these days, speak truth to power. The church exists for that. That's our prophetic voice. But again, where we get off on it is that we become mean-spirited about it. We take things personally. We get, they call it a cerebral hijack or whatever, a medicular hijack, when you can't think straight anymore. You just explode and you say dumb things like, when your kids gotten you to that place where you just lose grip, or your spouse, and you don't make any sense anymore, and you're unreasonable, and that certainly isn't the wisdom that comes from above, which is first of all peaceable. And there is a way, I think Ronald Reagan was one of the greatest at this in our day, in our whole generation. He was able to speak strong, and he used very strong language, but he did it graciously. He did it matter of fact, gracious. Even his enemies, people that hated him, said he's so disarming, the way he communicates what he believes. I totally disagree with every word he says, but he's so gracious about it. I almost feel like I don't want to argue with him, even though I completely disagree. I think we need to learn how to do that, how to communicate in a way that's not argumentative. It's not putting others down for the sake of lifting Christ up. And that's how we respond to persecution. I'll have more to share. Well, tonight we're doing the class tonight on Wednesday nights,
Okay.
Heavenly Perspectives class,
Awesome.
and we'll be talking about woke and how to respond to people that believe in some of the woke ideology,
Yeah.
and how to respond to people that are expecting you to agree that sin is good and good is sinful. And that's a big part of it, is when we speak, and I believe even Jesus, when he pronounced those woes, it was with a tear in his eye, it was with a genuine grief in his heart. It wasn't just like this anger that bubbled over and he finally had enough. There wasn't an explosive moment. It was Jesus weeping over them, and he said, I've longed to gather you as a mother hen gathers her chicks. I love you. I want you back. I miss how it was when we were intimate with each other. When the heart behind this temple was, you just wanted to have my presence in your midst. I long for those days. Carrying that kind of a heart, we can speak truth in things, and I think it really comes down to being all about the motive behind it. Is my desire to gather, or is my desire to scatter?
That's good. Thank you. And we have one more question about the sermon from Sunday, to kind of back into the sermon a little bit more with Saul. You spoke about this a few weeks ago, but it's coming up again in the story of David and Saul. That is the evil spirit that plagued Saul. and this person in particular asked, what do you mean from the Lord?
Yeah.
And so can you revisit that again for us?
Yeah,
much as you
it's so hard because you can't get away from it. I read it in the Hebrew. I tried to say, come on, it's got to say something different in the Hebrew. Nope, it's an evil spirit from the Lord. There's no way around it. So the Lord was the author of the spirit that tormented Saul. So there's a couple of different perspectives on it. One of them I believe I shared was that you could also, reading into the words, see that the Lord's spirit had become evil to Saul.
Okay.
And that is a legitimate translation of that, the Hebrew in that, which would mean that once your heart's become so hardened toward God, once you've gotten to where evil is good and good is evil, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is better than the tree of life. When you've gotten so hard in your heart to that place, the presence of the Lord is contemptuous to you. And it's, Paul got at that with, we are the aroma of Christ. To those who are being saved, it's a fragrant aroma. To those who are not, it's like the smell of crap. It's, and as a difference is not the person carrying it, it's the one smelling it. And so that is a legitimate thing. It's kind of like, God's presence is like fire. He is a consuming fire. And depending what kind of material you're made of, you either love fire or you hate fire. If you're made of flammable, combustible material, you don't like fire. You don't want to be anywhere near fire because that's the end of you. You literally explode in its presence. And so God doesn't have to change. He is evil to some and he is good to others. It's like the screw tape letters.
Okay.
Where God's the enemy now, if you're screw tape. So that's one perspective on it. The other is that, and this is Old Covenant, God doesn't do it like this in the New Covenant. He doesn't treat, the wrath of God poured out on Christ on the cross, I believe, made a transition in how God relates with humanity. It's a new covenant day. It's a new era. Now we have access to things that were previously inaccessible before Christ. So in the Old Covenant world, Pharaoh's heart's hardened by God. Pharaoh would not let the people go. After some plagues, he finally had enough. Maybe the punishment was enough, and he relented and he said, I'm going to let the people go. And this is, and God hardened his heart, as if to say, no, that wasn't enough yet. And even Romans talks about Israel, and he says, a partial hardening has come upon them until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. So it's like Israel had already hardened its heart. They crucified the Lord of glory, and God said, all right, I'm going to keep your heart hard now for a generation, so that there's opportunity for the Gentiles to come into this kingdom. And then Paul just says it matter of factly, God will harden who he wants to, and he'll not harden who he doesn't want to harden. It's just that simple, that God's sovereign and he can do that. So when it comes to that evil spirit from God that tormented Saul, Saul had already demonstrated a contempt for the presence of God, right? He didn't wait for the sacrifice, and he didn't finish off the Amalekites, which in and of themselves wasn't that bad. I mean, you compare it to sins of others, even David's sins. those were not so egregious that, oh man, that's the worst thing anybody ever did. It was his response to it.
Okay.
And it, like Kevin, I believe I brought this out, how
Yeah.
he would say, the Lord your God to Samuel. The God who anointed him king, who lifted him up from being a nobody to being king of the promised people of God, still didn't have anything to do with God. I like the authority you gave me. I like this role, but you're not my God. You're Samuel's God. And he treated God that way. And all he cared about now was the show in front of the people and his power. That God said, okay, that's who you want to be. And now you're going to experience the torment of what it's like. Call it unfair, call it what you have. Honestly, I'm not God. We can't pretend to know that, why did God wipe out all the Amalekites? Man, it seems so harsh.
Yeah.
He's the same yesterday, today, and forever, right? How could he wipe out a whole people group, all the Canaanites? He told Israel when they went in, wipe them all out. I don't want to hear any of their babies crying or so much as a sheep bleeding left behind. And that sounds so harsh to us, but knowing God's heart, knowing his love, knowing his character, there must have been something pretty awful going on there. When God says, I can't redeem this, that this is irredeemable, like the days of the flood, this is irredeemable. Give me one family in an ark and we're going to start over. And he does get to that place. But the torment from that evil spirit that came from the Lord's presence, I believe that same spirit, if somebody who loved God were in the presence of that spirit, they would not experience torment. Yeah, I think I'll just leave it right there.
Okay,
What you think about that?
That's a really good answer. Thank you. It's almost like the heart ultimately matters, because David had a heart, but he's still hard after God, it says, but he sinned. So the heart is really important.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
We have your questions answered. Hope to hear more questions from you. Like I said earlier, you can chat with me. Don't grab me after service, but you can talk to me after service. There we go. Or you can message us on Facebook, comment on that live stream. Wherever you find us, you can comment, and we'll attempt to answer your questions. Well, you're doing a pretty good job, more than attempting. You're answering some good questions here that are tough. So
These
thank
are good
you.
questions. Yeah. I
Thank
love
you.
that.
Yeah. Appreciate it. All right. Take care.